Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be able to present this evidence gap map. I'm going to be using an acronym, so listen closely right now. Adolescent Sexual and Reproductive Health, ASRH, Evidence Gap Map, EGM. So be prepared because I know it will slip in rather than I'll save 10 minutes by not having to say the words. So I'm excited, as I say, to present this evidence gap map, but I can't take any credit for its development. I came into 3IE in January of 2017, right after the evidence gap map had been completed. And so much of what you're going to hear today is the result of input from my colleagues, one of who worked on the map is sitting here, Nancy. I may be addressing questions to her. But secondly, I'm going to provide some input. Prior to joining 3IE, I worked for the United States Agency for International Development for many years, and I worked for a number of non-governmental organizations in program implementation, principally in Africa. So I'll give the perspective as both a one-time donor and a one-time user as I move forward. So this particular map was funded, we are very grateful to the Hewlett Foundation. Again, as Berta said, the demand was for evidence of effectiveness, and that would be impact evaluation and quality systematic reviews. It was focused on low and middle income countries, and specifically on adolescents 10 to 19 years old. So the next slide, as we have many economists sitting in this room, we know that use is somewhere between supply and demand. And often when people talk about evidence gap maps, they're very focused on supply. We're producing the supply. What is the evidence out there in terms of impact evaluations and systematic reviews? But actually, in terms of being able to generate use, we also need to know, well, what is the demand for the evidence? So if there is high demand and low evidence, that's what low supply, we identify that as a gap. There may be low demand and high supply. There may be low demand and low supply. In that case, we might not say that there's actually an evidence gap. So we in the Washington office, when they developed this evidence gap map, a lot of effort was put into assessing demand, not just into assessing the supply. And in order to do that, involved a lot of stakeholder engagement, and that was one of the issues I was asked to address today. There were three aspects of stakeholder engagement in the development of this evidence gap map, both the supply and demand, an advisory group, expert consultation, stakeholder survey. And I'm going to talk about each of them to a lesser or greater extent. These were the members of our advisory group. As you can see, they're donors who often have the first demand and often supply the funding, a very important group. The expert consultations, there was a series of processes, if you will, one-on-one interviews, presentations, and consultative workshops. They're listed here. I'm not going to go into the details. Hosted by 3IE and by others, including our advisory group. And one of the lessons I learned was the importance of leveraging our members. As you know, 3IE is a member-based organization, and in order to generate who are the stakeholders in developing an evidence gap map, one place to begin is with our members, who are both donors and researchers and implementers, a very important constituency. But also reaching out to these stakeholders is like herding cats. There was a wide level of technical competency, experience. You have researchers, and that is both in the sense of research and programming. And the interests of those different groups are highly variable. Trying to reach consensus amongst them is like herding cats. And so one lesson learned is it does take a high degree of diplomacy and negotiation and consensus building. And oftentimes, as I understand, it was ultimately when there was disagreement, it's often the donor who makes decisions, in part because they control the funds. So just something to keep in mind. I want to talk a little bit about the stakeholder survey. My colleagues told me that this was not an all, even though we're all researchers and do develop surveys all the time, they said that actually it was exceedingly difficult to develop questions that would elicit the answers that they actually needed. And let me give you an example. So when you're trying to assess demand, a couple of the questions they asked is, what is your perception of the need for evidence? And what areas do we need evidence? So it's a perception question. And similarly, on the different topics, what is your perception of the strength of the evidence? I mean, there's a lot of M&E data, a lot of process evaluations, a lot of qualitative research, but we're looking for IEs and for systematic reviews. And what they found was often perceptions did not meet reality. And if reality is what was in the end revealed by the evidence gap map, often respondents perceived there were gaps when there weren't. They perceived the evidence was strong when it wasn't. And so my colleague said that one thing to be really careful about is, and another thing is that oftentimes those who have the most experience, technical expertise, who really know the topic, research-wise, were the ones who had the least amount of time to respond to the survey. So they would get individuals who responded, whose voices were important, but weren't necessarily the ones with the depth of knowledge that was needed. So it's important to work really hard on your distribution list, how you phrase these questions, and also response rates. Response rates are really important. The next slide is just to show you an example of the range of topics that in this snowballing effect, what people wanted to look at, this is not all inclusive. And I laugh because I think Berta mentioned that we're looking for ways to make evidence gap maps, the generation. The idea is to rapidly generate information for use, and yet there's a lot of mission creep. Meaning, once you start getting stakeholders together, what they're interested in, what they want to know about, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's problematic. That's another area where you have to really think about, we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, in the Q&A. There's scope, there's quality, there's cost, and all those factors have to be taken into account when you decide what the map. My colleagues also told me one thing to be careful about is to make sure that whatever map you ultimately produce can fit on a page. So I thought that was good advice. And this is just an example to give you just, a visual of exactly what the research process looks like. I mean, if you see 26,172 search results is what was started with. And then I'm not going to, go through each level, but what they ended up with were 152 impact evaluations and 14 systematic reviews. Now, this looks very straightforward, but as all of you know, incredibly complicated. They did have 2 screeners for every study. The standardization of the review, the quality. This is where, as we say, the real work needs to happen if you want to produce a quality product. You may be frustrated by the fact that I'm going to go very quickly through the next slide. This is our evidence gap map. Berta did, I'm not going to get into the map. Berta explained, you have outcomes, you have interventions, you now know what the different colors mean and the size of the bullets. I want to move in the last few minutes to some of the results in terms of what we need to think about when we talk about use. So this is one result in terms of the supply of the evidence by region. Okay, clearly one can draw the conclusion that, the vast majority were in sub-Saharan Africa. One thing that may be deceptive is that a large proportion of those studies came from a relatively few number of countries. So those are the kinds of things you need to keep in mind. Yes, there may be, relatively speaking, quite a few in sub-Saharan Africa, but maybe they only come from 6 countries for the most part. Additionally, oh yes, this was only an English language search. Okay, say no more. The state of the evidence, these are just some results, again, in terms of the supply, major findings, lack of gender responsive evaluations. We are talking about this issue a lot today, very important. I already spoke to the fact that there was a relatively narrow geographic coverage. Lack of studies focused on family planning. I think this came as a surprise. What? You know, adolescent sexual reproductive health. But in fact, that's largely due to most of the studies were funded HIV prevention in large part from the, you know, the HIV Funding President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and the Global Fund in the past 10 years. If that's where the money went, that's what's been researched. And then the lack of cost-effective analysis. So what I'm showing now, these are, and now I'm going to get into the evidence gaps, just to give you again a glimpse of, I'm just going to go forward on this. What you see circled in this particular graph is where there was relatively low supply, and it's all relative, but high demand for evidence. This is what I was saying before about gaps. And we'll be sharing this PowerPoint, and you can also go on our website and read the report. But this is exceedingly important in terms of potential use, not just to promote advocacy for research, but for programming and policy. Those evidence gaps are critical. Okay, almost, here are some of the synthesis gaps that were determined, not just impact evaluation, primary studies. There was a high demand for more quality synthesis, you know, specifically for low and middle income countries. These are some examples of the topics that were identified. One thing that strikes me as I was looking through the results is how specific the actual, I mean, when you think about this is a huge topic. And yet, this is a really nice, well-defined group of 4 that we're all going to go out now and do advocacy to get funding to do syntheses on these topics, right? You're going to join us in that effort. And then finally, I want to leave you with, again, this is my perspective as I would say, as a former donor and a former implementer, a user of the evidence. As the first this evidence gap map was being disseminated through webinars and I was observing, it was right when I came on board, and I was really struck by some of the questions that people were asking in that first webinar, which I think was my first week on the job, it was clear to me that people didn't understand what they were looking at. And this was principally implementers and policymakers who are really critical constituents for us, stakeholders. So for example, many rigorous IEs, impact evaluation studies in a cell, does not mean the intervention should be scaled up. So people would ask the question, so what do we scale up? Where should we put our money? We provide the evidence, but we do not provide information about what that evidence says. You might go into the cell, as Berta showed, and hit the link and read, and there's null effect, right? And there could be a lot of null effect. And even if there is an effect, individuals need to read and study for themselves. What are the implications of that? What are the confounders? So it's really important as you're presenting and using these EGMs to be clear that this is not a statement about what is the most effective in this intervention and outcome area. A second is that lack of evidence in a cell, I've already talked about this, does not mean that evidence is needed. If there's no demand, there may not, whether there should be a demand is another issue, but if there is no demand, you're going to have a hard time generating, whether that be from government or from donors, it's going to be hard to make the case to invest in further research. I think where there are a large number of IE studies in high demand, that's a sweet spot for synthesis, and we need to keep that in mind. The next point I'm raising is really the one I'm going to give you from my experience. Right before I joined 3IE, I was providing technical assistance to the government of Rwanda in developing their next 5-year adolescent sexual and reproductive health plan. And this was via a USAID-funded project that provides technical assistance of this sort, much of which I have managed in the past and have been on the implementer side of. And one of the first things that was in the scope of work was to do a literature review. This is over and over and over again. Governments are doing new policies, new strategy, literature review. And I thought, I'm not doing a literature review. I went to the evidence gap map, and quickly, all the time they had put in, not to say they also wanted gray literature, local, but if we focus on, for governments especially, and policymakers, an excellent entry point for use is when a new policy strategic plan is being developed. And we were asked during the conference, our members said, please focus, are you here, on the SDGs. We could go through every SDG and look for which there are evidence gap maps and start promoting that in countries. As here we have these evidence gap maps and synthesis reports, you're developing a policy, you're looking at this topic, start here. And my last point is really the question that I think we need to discuss. There are huge trade-offs between the scope, the quality, the timeliness, and the cost. And I encourage everybody, whether you're commissioning one or you're a 3IE side and a grantee who's developing one, from the very beginning, it's really important to pay attention to not to have the mission creep where you could never cover, because it happens. Mission creep, mission creep, mission creep. They want more and more and more and more. There's no way you can cover all that for the cost and ensure the quality. And timeliness is also an issue, so I'll leave you with that.